Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of Napoleon's Marshals by R.P. Dunn-Pattison. Chapter 3, André Masséna, Marshal, Duke of Rivoli, Prince of Essling.
André Masséna, the wiliest of Italians, was born at Nice on May 6, 1758, where his father and mother carried on a considerable business as tanners and soap manufacturers. On his father's death, when André was still but a small boy, his mother at once married again. Thereon, André and two of his sisters were adopted by their uncle Augustine, who proposed to give his nephew a place in his business. But André's restless, fiery nature could not brook the idea of a perpetual, monotonous existence in the tanyard and soap factory. So at the age of 13, he ran away from home and shipped as a cabin boy. As such, he made several voyages in the Mediterranean, and on one occasion crossed the Atlantic to Cayenne. But, in spite of his love of adventure, the life of a sailor soon began to pall, and on August 18, 1775, at the age of 17, he enlisted in the Royal Italian Regiment in the French service. There he came under the influence of his uncle Marcel, who was sergeant major of the regiment. Thanks to his advice and care, he made rapid strides in his profession, and received a fair education in the regimental school. In later years, the marshal used to say that no step cost him so much trouble or gave him such pleasure as his promotion to corporal. Be that as it may, promotion came rapidly, and with less than 2 years' service he became sergeant on April 15, 1777. For 14 years, Masséna served in the Royal Italians, but at last he retired in disgust. Under the regulations, a commission was unattainable for those who were not of noble birth, and the officers of the regiment had taken a strong dislike to the sergeant, whom the colonel constantly held up as an example, telling them, "Your ignorance of drill is shameful. Your inferiors, Masséna, for example, can maneuver the battalion far better than any of you." On his retirement, Masséna lived at Nice. To occupy his time and earn a living, he joined his cousin Bavastro, and carried on a large smuggling business, both by sea and land. He thus gained that intimate knowledge of the defiles and passes of the maritime Alps, which stood him in such good stead in the numerous campaigns of the Revolutionary Wars, while the necessity for keeping a watch on the preventive men, and thus concealing his own movements, developed to a great extent his activity, resource, and daring. So successful were his operations that he soon found himself in the position to demand the hand of Mademoiselle Lamar, daughter of a surgeon, possessed of a considerable dowry. When the Revolutionary Wars broke out, the Massénas were established at Antibes, where they did a fair trade in olive oil and dried fruits. But a respectable humdrum existence could not satisfy the restless nature of the ex-sergeant, and in 1791 he applied for a sub-lieutenancy in the gendarmerie. And it is to be presumed that, on the principle of setting a thief to catch a thief, he would have made an excellent policeman. It was at this moment that the invasion of France by the monarchs of Europe caused all patriotic Frenchmen to obey the summons to arms. Masséna gladly left his shop to serve as adjutant of the volunteers of the Var. His military knowledge, his erect and proud bearing, his keen, incisive speech, and absolute self-confidence in all difficulties soon dominated his comrades. And it was as lieutenant colonel commanding the 2nd Battalion that he marched to the frontier to meet the enemy. Lean and spare, below middle height, with a highly expressive Italian face, a good mouth, an aquiline nose, and black, sparkling eyes, from the very first Masséna inspired confidence in all who met him. But it was not till he was seen in action that the greatness of his qualities could best be appreciated. As Napoleon said of him at St. Helena, Masséna was at his best and most brilliant in the middle of the fire and disorder of battle. The roar of the cannon used to clear his ideas, give him insight, penetration, and gaiety. In the middle of the dead and dying, among the hail of bullets which swept down all around him, Masséna was always himself giving his orders and making his dispositions with the greatest calmness and good judgment. There you see the true nobility of blood. In the saddle from morning till night, absolutely insensible to fatigue, ready at any moment to take the responsibility of his actions, he returned from the first campaign in the Riviera as Major General. During the siege of Toulon, he commanded the Camp de Mille Fourches, which included the company of artillery commanded by Bonaparte, and distinguished himself by taking the forts of l'Artige and St. Catherine, thus earning his step as lieutenant general, while his future commander was still a major in the artillery. In the campaign of 1794, it was Masséna who conceived and carried out the turning movement, which drove the Sardinians from the Col de Tenda, while Bonaparte's share in the action merely consisted of commanding the artillery. As the trusted counselor of de Mourbillon, Kellermann, and Scherer, for the next 2 years, the lieutenant general was the inspirer of the successive commanders of the Army of Italy. He it was who, amid the snow and storms, planned and carried out the combinations which gained for Scherer the great winter victory at Loano, and thus first taught the French the secret, which the English had grasped on the sea and Napoleon was to perfect on land, of breaking the enemy's center and falling on one wing with overwhelming force. The campaign of 1796 for the time being altered the current of Masséna's military life. Before the young Corsican's eagle gaze, even the impetuous Italian quailed, and from being the brain of the officer commanding the army, he had to revert to the position of the right arm and faithful interpreter of orders. 2 things, however, compensated Masséna for the change of role, for Bonaparte gave his subordinate fighting and glory with a lavish hand, and above all, winked at, nay, rather encouraged, the amassing of booty, and wealth more even than glory was the desire of Masséna's soul. At the very commencement of the campaign, Masséna committed a fault which almost ruined his career. After defeating the enemy's advance guard near Cairo, hearing by chance that the Austrian officers had left an excellent dinner in a neighboring inn, he and some of his staff left his division on the top of a high hill and set off to enjoy the good things prepared for the enemy. At daybreak, the enemy attempted a surprise on the French position on the hill, and the troops, without their general and staff, were in great danger. Fortunately, Masséna had time to make his way through the Austrian skirmishers and resume his command. He was greeted by hoots and jeers, but with absolute imperturbability, he reorganized his forces and checked the enemy. But one battalion was isolated on a spur, from which there seemed no way of escape, save under a scorching flank fire. Masséna made his way alone to this detached post, scrambling up the steep slope on his hands and knees, and when he at last reached the troops, remembering his old smuggling expedients, he showed them how to glissade down the steep part of the hill, and brought them all safely back without a single casualty. This escapade came to Bonaparte's ears, and it was only Masséna's great share in the victory of Montenotte which saved him from a court-martial. Bonaparte, at the commencement of the campaign, had ended a letter of instructions to his lieutenant with the words, "Watchfulness and bluff, that is the card." And well, Masséna learned his lesson. Montenotte, the bridge of Lodi, the long struggle at Castiglione, the 2 fights at Rivoli, and the marshes of Arcola proved beyond doubt that of all the young conqueror of Italy's lieutenants, none had the insight, activity, and endurance of Masséna. But empty flattery did not satisfy him, for as early as Lonato, greedy for renown, he considered his success had not been fully recognized. In bitter anger, he wrote to Bonaparte, "I complain of your reports of Lonato and Rovereto, in which you do not render me the justice that I merit. This forgetfulness tears my heart and throws discouragement on my soul. I will recall the fact under compulsion that the victory of St. George was due to my dispositions, to my activity, to my sang-froid, and to my provision." This frank republican letter greatly displeased Bonaparte, who, since Lodi, had cherished visions of a crown, and to realize this desire had begun to issue his praise and rewards irrespective of merit, and to appeal to the private soldier while visiting his displeasure on the officers. But Masséna's brilliant conduct at the Second Battle of Rivoli, for the moment, blotted out all rancor, for it was Masséna who had saved the day, who had rushed up to the commander of the shaken regiment, bitterly upbraiding him and his officers, showering blows on them with the flat of his sword, and had then galloped off and brought up 2 tried regiments of his own invincible division and driven back the assailants. From that moment, Bonaparte confirmed him in the title of the spoilt child of victory. In 1797, Bonaparte gave his lieutenant a more substantial reward when he chose him to carry the dispatches to Paris, which reported the preliminary Treaty of Leoben. Thus, it was as the right-hand man of the most distinguished general in Europe that the Italians saw, for the first time, the capital of his adopted country. In choosing Masséna to carry to Paris the tidings of peace, it was not only his prestige and renown which influenced Bonaparte. For Paris was in a state of half-suppressed excitement, and signs were only too evident that the Directory was unstable. Accordingly, the wily Corsican, while dispatching secret agents to advance his cause, was careful to send as the bearer of the good news a man who was well known to care for no political rewards, and who would be sure to turn a deaf ear to the insidious schemes of those who were plotting to restore the monarchy or to set up a dictatorship, and were searching for a sovereign or a Caesar, as their political views suggested. It was for these reasons, and because he was tired of Masséna's greed and avarice, that Bonaparte refused to admit him among those chosen to accompany him to Egypt. Masséna saw clearly all the secret intrigue of the capital, and found little pleasure in his newly gained dignity of a seat among the ancients, for he was extremely afraid of a royalist restoration, in which case he feared our honorable wounds will become the titles for our prescription. Tired of Paris, in 1798, he was glad to accept the command of the French corps occupying Rome when its former commander, BERTHIER, was called away to join the Egyptian expedition. On his arrival at Rome to take over his new command, he found himself face to face with a mutiny. The troops were in rags and badly fed. Their pay was months in arrear, and meanwhile the civil servants of the Directory were amassing fortunes at the expense of the Pope, the cardinals, and the princes of Rome. Discontent was so widespread that the new general at once ordered all troops, save some 3,000, to leave the capital. Unfortunately, Masséna's record was not such as to inspire confidence in the purity of his intentions. Instead of obeying, the officers and men held a mass meeting to draft their remonstrance to the Directory. In this document, they accused, first of all, the agents who had disgraced the name of France, and ended by saying, "The final cause of all the discontent is the arrival of General Masséna. The soldiers have not forgotten the extortions and robberies he has committed wherever he has been invested with the command. The Venetian territory, and above all Padua, is a district teeming with proofs of his immorality." In the face of such public feeling, Masséna found nothing for it but to demand a successor and throw up his command. But with Bonaparte in Egypt and a ring of enemies threatening France from all sides, the directors, whose hands were as soiled as Masséna's, could ill spare the spoilt child of victory. Accordingly, early in 1799, the general found himself invested with the important command of the army of Switzerland. This was a task worthy of his genius, and he eagerly accepted the post, but refused to abide by the stipulations the directors desired to enforce on him, as, according to their plan, the army of Switzerland was to form part of the army of the Rhine commanded by Joubert. Masséna had obeyed Bonaparte, but he had no intention of playing second fiddle to any other commander, and, after some stormy interviews and letters, he at last had his way. As the year advanced, it became more and more evident that on the army of Switzerland would fall the full brunt of the attack of the coalition. For Joubert was defeated by the Archduke Charles at Stockach and thrown back on the Rhine. Scherer was defeated in Italy at Magnano, and by June, the Russians and Austrians had begun to close in on Switzerland. It was clear that if the French army were driven out of Switzerland, both the Rhine and the Maritime Alps would be turned, and the enemy would be in a strong position from which to invade France. On Masséna, therefore, hung all the hopes of the Directory. Fortunately for France, the general was admirably versed in mountain warfare. Well aware of the difficulty of keeping up communication between the different parts of his line of defense, Masséna skillfully withdrew his outposts as the enemy pressed on, with the intention of concentrating his troops round Zurich, thereby covering all the possible lines of advance. But early in the summer, his difficulties were further increased by the rising of the Swiss peasantry. Luckily, however, the Archduke Charles advanced most cautiously, while the Aulic Council at Vienna, unable to grasp the vital point of the problem, stupidly sent its reserve army to Italy to reinforce the Russians under Suvorov. By June 5th, the Archduke had driven in all the outlying French columns and was in a position to attack the lines of Zurich with his entire force. Thanks, however, to Masséna's courage and presence of mind, the attack was driven off. But so overwhelming were the numbers of the enemy that during the night the French army evacuated Zurich, though only to fall back on a strong position on Mount Albis, a rocky ridge at the north end of the lake, covered on one flank by the lake and on the other by the river Aar. The two armies, for the time being, lay opposite to each other, too exhausted after the struggle to recommence operations. The Archduke Charles awaited the arrival from Italy of Suvorov, who was to debouch on the French right by the St. Gothard Pass. But fortune, or rather the Aulic Council at Vienna, once again intervened and saved France. The Archduke Charles was ordered to leave 55,000 Russians under Korsakov before Zurich and to march northwards and across the Rhine. Protests were useless. The court of Vienna merely ordered the Archduke to perform the immediate execution of its will without further objections. But even yet disaster threatened the French, for Suvorov was commencing his advance by the St. Gothard. But Masséna at once grasped the opportunity fortune had placed in his power by opposing him to a commander like Korsakov, who was so impressed by his own pride that he considered a Russian company equal to an Austrian battalion. On September 26th, by a masterly series of maneuvers, the main French force surprised Korsakov and drove him en route out of Zurich. Suvorov arrived just in time to find Masséna in victorious array, thrust in between himself and his countrymen, and was forced to save himself by a hurried retreat through the most difficult passes of the Alps. The campaign of Zurich will always be studied as a masterpiece in defensive warfare. The skillful use the French general made of the mountain passes, the methods he employed to check the Archduke's advance on Zurich, the care with which he kept up communications between his different columns, the skillful choice of the positions of Zurich and Mount Albis, his return to the initiative on every opportunity, and his masterly interposition between Korsakov and Suvorov, alone entitle him to a high place among the great commanders of history, and Masséna was rightly thanked by the legislature and hailed as the savior of the country. 6 weeks after the victory of Zurich came the 18th Brumaire and Napoleon's accession to the consulate. Masséna, a staunch Republican, was conscious of the defects of the Directory, but could not give his hearty consent to the coup d'état, for he feared for the liberty of his country. Still, he said, if France desired to entrust her independence and glory to one man, she could choose none better than Bonaparte. The latter, on his side, was anxious to retain Masséna's affections, and at once offered him the command of the army of Italy. But the conqueror of Zurich foresaw that everything was to be sacrificed to the glory of the first consul, and it was only after great persuasion, profuse promises, and appeals to his patriotism that he undertook the command, with the stipulation that I will not take command of an army condemned to rest on the defensive. My former services and successes do not permit me to change the role that I have heretofore played in the wars of the Republic. The first consul replied by giving Masséna carte blanche to requisition whatever he wanted, and promised him that the army of Italy should be his first care. But when Masséna arrived at Genoa, he discovered, as he had suspected, that Bonaparte's promises were only made to be broken. For he found the troops entrusted to his care the mere shadow of an army, the hospitals full, bands of soldiers, even whole battalions, quitting their posts and trying to escape into France, and the officers and generals absolutely unable to contend with the mass of misery and want. In spite of his able lieutenants, SOULT and SUCHET, he could make no head against the Austrians in the field, and after some gallant engagements was driven back into Genoa, where for 2 months he held out against famine and the assaults of the enemy. While the wretched inhabitants starved, the troops were fed on a miserable ration of 1/4 pound of horseflesh and 1/4 pound of what was called bread, a horrible compound of damaged flour, sawdust, starch, hair powder, oatmeal, linseed, rancid nuts, and other nasty substances, to which a little solidity was given by the admixture of a small portion of cocoa. Each loaf, moreover, was held together by little bits of wood, without which it would have fallen to powder. A revolt, threatened by the inhabitants, was checked by Masséna's order that an assemblage of over 5 persons should be fired on, and the approaches to the principal streets were commanded by guns. Still, he refused to surrender, as every day he expected to hear the cannon of the First Consul's army thundering on the Austrian rear. One day, the hopes of all were aroused by a distant roar in the mountains, only to be dashed by finding it to be thunder. It was simply the ascendancy of Masséna's personality which prolonged the agony and upheld his authority, and in bitter earnestness the soldiers used to say, "He will make us eat his boots before he will surrender." At last the accumulated horrors shook even his firm spirit, and on June 4th a capitulation was agreed on. The terms were most favorable to the French, but as Lord Keith, the English admiral, said, "General, your defense has been so heroic that we can refuse you nothing." However, the sufferings of Genoa were not in vain, for Masséna had played his part and held the main Austrian force in check for 10 days longer than had been demanded of him. Thus, the First Consul had time to fall on the enemy's line of communication, and it may be truly said that without the siege of Genoa, there could have been no Marengo. Masséna had once again demonstrated the importance of the individual in war. As Bonaparte wrote to him during the siege, "In such a situation as you are, a man like you is worth 20,000 men." In spite of this, at St. Helena, the emperor, ever jealous of his own glory, affected to despise Masséna's generalship and endurance at Genoa, and blamed him for not taking the offensive in the field, forgetting the state of his army and the paucity of his troops. But at the moment, he showed his appreciation of his services by giving him the command of the army when he himself retired to Paris after the victory of Marengo. Unfortunately, Masséna's avarice and greed were unable to withstand the temptations of the position, and the First Consul had very soon to recall him from Italy and mark his displeasure by placing him on half pay. For 2 years, the disgraced general brooded over his wrongs in retirement, and showed his attitude of mind by voting against the consulate for life and the establishment of the empire. The gift of a marshal's baton did little to reconcile him to the emperor, for, as he scoffingly replied to Thibault's congratulations, "Oh, there are 14 of us." So uncertain was the emperor of his marshal's disposition that, on the outbreak of the war with Austria, Masséna alone of all the greater marshals held no command. But with the prospect of heavy fighting in Italy, the emperor could not afford to entrust the Italian divisions to a blunderer, and he once again posted Masséna to his old command. The Austrians had occupied the strong position of Caldiero, near the marshes of Arcola, and the French in vain attempted to force them from it. But the success of the emperor on the Danube at last compelled the Archduke John to fall back on Austria. The marshal at once commenced a spirited pursuit, and ultimately joined hands with the Grand Army south of the Danube. After the Treaty of Pressburg, Napoleon dispatched Masséna to conquer Naples, which he had given as a kingdom to his brother Joseph. With 50,000 men, the marshal swept through Italy. In vain, the gallant Queen Caroline armed the Lazzaroni. Capua opened its gates, Gaeta fell after 12 days' bombardment, and Joseph entered Naples in triumph. Calabria alone offered a stern resistance, and this resistance the French brought upon themselves by their cruelty to the peasantry, whom they treated as brigands. Unfortunately, his success in Naples was once again tarnished by his greed, for the marshal, by selling licenses to merchants and conniving at their escape from the custom house dues, amassed, within a few months of his entering Naples, a sum of 3 million francs. Napoleon heard of this from his spies and, writing to him, demanded a loan of 1 million francs. The Duke of Rivoli replied that he was the poorest of the marshals and had a numerous family to maintain and was heavily in debt, so he regretted that he could send him nothing. Unfortunately, the emperor knew where he banked in Leghorn, and as he refused to disgorge a third of his illicit profits, the emperor sent the inspector of the French treasury and a police commissary to the bank, and demanded that the 3 millions, which lay at his account there, should be handed over. The seizure was made in legal form. The banker, who lost nothing, was bound to comply with it. Masséna, on hearing of this misfortune, was so furious that he fell ill, but he did not dare to remonstrate, knowing that he was in the wrong, but he never forgave the emperor. His titles and a pension never consoled him for what he lost at Leghorn, and in spite of his cautious habits, he was sometimes heard to say, "I was fighting in his service, and he was cruel enough to take away my little savings, which I had invested at Leghorn." From what he called a military promenade in Italy, the Marshal was summoned early in 1807 to the Grand Army in Poland and was present in command of one of the army corps at Pultusk, Ostrolenka, and Friedland. In 1808, he received his title of Duke of Rivoli and a pension of 300,000 francs per annum, but in spite of this, he absented himself from the court. When Joseph was given the crown of Spain, he requested his brother to send Masséna to aid him in his new sphere. But the emperor, full of mistrust, refused, while the marshal himself had no great desire to serve in Spain. When it was clear that Austria was going to seize the occasion of the Spanish War once again to fight France, Napoleon hastened to send the veteran Duke of Rivoli to the army on the Danube. At Abensberg and Eckmühl, for the first time since 1797, he fought under the eye of Napoleon himself. "Activité, activité, vitesse," wrote the emperor, and well his lieutenant carried out his orders. Following up the 5 days' fighting, Masséna led the advance guard to Vienna and commanded the left wing at Aspern-Essling. Standing in the churchyard at Aspern, with the boughs swept down by grape shot crashing round him, he was in his element. Never had his tenacity, his resource, and skill been seen to such advantage. But in spite of his skill and the courage of his troops, at the end of the first day's fighting, his shattered forces were driven out of the heap of smoking ruins which marked all that remained of Aspern. On the morning of the second day, he had regained half of the village when news came that the bridge was broken, and that he was to hold off the Austrians while communication with the Isle of Lobau was being established. The enemy, invigorated by the news of the success of their plan for breaking the bridges, strained every nerve to annihilate the French force on the left bank of the river, but Masséna, LANNES, and Napoleon worked marvels with their exhausted troops. The Duke of Rivoli seemed ubiquitous, at one moment on horseback and at another on foot with drawn sword. Wherever the enemy pressed, he was there animating his troops, directing their fire, hurrying up supports. Thus, thanks to his exertions, the Austrians were held off. The cavalry and the artillery safely crossed the bridge, and the veteran marshal at midnight brought the last of the rearguard safely to the Isle of Lobau, where, exhausted by fatigue, the troops fell asleep in their ranks. The death of Lannes threw Napoleon back on the Duke of Rivoli, who for the time became his confidant and right-hand man. It was Masséna who commanded at Lobau and made all the arrangements for the crossing before Wagram. The emperor and his lieutenant were indefatigable in the care with which they made their preparations. On one occasion, wishing to inspect the Austrian position, dressed in sergeants' greatcoats, attended by a single aide-de-camp in the kit of a private, they went alone up the north bank of the island and took their coats off as if they wanted to bathe. The Austrian sentinels, seeing, as they thought, 2 French soldiers enjoying a wash, took no notice of them, and thus the emperor and the marshal were able to determine the exact spot for launching the bridges. On another occasion, while they were riding round the island, the marshal's horse put its foot into a hole and fell, and injured the rider's leg so that he could not mount again. This unfortunate accident happened a few days before the Battle of Wagram, so the Duke of Rivoli went into battle lying in a light calèche, drawn by 4 white horses, with his doctor beside him changing the compresses on his injured leg every 2 hours. During the battle, Masséna's corps formed the left of the line. While DAVOUT was carrying out his great turning movement, it was the Duke of Rivoli who had to endure the full fury of the Austrians' attack. In the pursuit after the battle, he pressed the enemy with his wonted activity. At the last encounter at Znaim, he had a narrow escape, for hardly had he got out of his carriage when a cannonball struck it, and a moment later another shot killed one of the horses. After the Treaty of Vienna, the Marshal, newly created Prince of Essling, retired to rest at his country house at Rueil, but the Emperor could not spare him long. In April 1810, within 8 months, he was once again hurried off on active service, this time to Spain, where Soult had been driven out of Portugal by Sir Arthur Wellesley, and Jourdan and Joseph defeated at Talavera. The emperor promised the Prince of Essling 90,000 troops for the invasion of Portugal, and placed under his command Junot and Ney. The marshal did his best to refuse the post. He knew the difficult character of Ney and the jealousy of Junot, and he pointed out that it would be better to reorganize the army of Portugal under generals appointed by himself. Berthier replied that the orders of the emperor were positive and left no point in dispute. When the emperor delegated his authority, obedience became a duty. However great might be the pride of the Dukes of Elchingen and Abrantes, they had enough justice to understand that their swords were not in the same line as the sword of the conqueror of Zurich. Still, the prince foresaw the future and appealed to the emperor himself, but the emperor was obdurate. "You are out of humor today, my dear Masséna. You see everything black, yourself and your surroundings. To listen to you, one would think you were half dead. Your age? A good reason. How much older are you now than at Essling? Your health? Does not imagination play a great part in your weakness? Are you worse than at Wagram? It is rheumatism that is troubling you. The climate of Portugal is as warm and healthy as Italy, and will put you on your legs. Set out then with confidence. Be prudent and firm, and the obstacles you fear will fade away. You have surmounted many worse." Unfortunately for the marshal, his forebodings were truer than the emperor's optimism. On arriving at Salamanca, his troubles began. Delays were inevitable before he could bring into order his unruly team. Junot and Ney were openly contemptuous. Regnier hung back and was 3 weeks late in his arrangements. Meanwhile, all that Masséna saw of the enemy, whom the emperor had in past years stigmatized as the slow and clumsy English, confirmed him in his opinion that the campaign was going to prove the most arduous he had ever undertaken. In spite of everything, operations opened brilliantly for the French. Ciudad Rodrigo and Almeida fell without the English commander making any apparent effort to relieve them. On September 16th, the invasion of Portugal commenced. But losses, disease, and garrison duty had already reduced his troops to some 70,000 men, and the French found an enemy behind every stone. While, as the Prince of Essling wrote, "We are marching across a desert. Women, children, and old men have all fled. In fact, no guide is to be found anywhere." Still, the English fell back before him, and he was under the impression that they were going to evacuate Portugal without a blow, although he grasped the fact that it was the immense superiority of the French cavalry which had prevented the sepoy general making any effort to relieve the fortresses. But on September 26th, Masséna found that the English had stayed their retreat and were waiting to fight him on the rocky ridge of Busaco. Unfortunately for his reputation, he made no reconnaissance of the position, and trusting entirely to the reports of Ney, Regnier, and Junot, who asserted the position was much less formidable than it looked, sustained a heavy reverse. After the battle, his lieutenants urged him to abandon the invasion of Portugal, but the veteran refused such timorous advice, and rousing himself, soon showed the energy which had made his name so famous at Zurich and Rivoli. Turning the position, the French swept down on Portugal, while the English hurriedly fell back before them. What caused Masséna most anxiety was the ominous desertion of the countryside. He was well aware of the bitter hatred of the Portuguese, and knew that his soldiers tortured and hung the wretched inhabitants to force them to reveal hidden stores of provisions. But it was not until October 10th, when the French had arrived within a few miles of the lines of Torres Vedras, that he learned of the vast entrenched camp which the English commander had so secretly prepared for his army and the inhabitants of Portugal. Masséna was furious and covered with accusations the Portuguese officers on his staff. "Que diable," he cried, "Wellington n'a pas construit des montagnes." But there had been no treachery. Only so well had the secret been kept that hardly even an officer in the English army knew of the existence of the work. And as Wellington wrote to the minister at Lisbon on October 6th, "I believe that you and the government do not know where the lines are." For 6 weeks, the indomitable marshal lay in front of the position, hoping to tempt the English to attack his army, now reduced to 60,000 men. But Wellington, who had planned this victorious reply to the axiom that war ought to feed war, grimly sat behind his lines, while the English army, well fed from the sea, watched the French writhe in the toils of hunger. Masséna was now roused, and as his opponent wrote, "It is certainly astonishing that the enemy have been able to remain in this country so long. It is an extraordinary instance of what a French army can do." At last, even Masséna had to confess himself beaten and fall back on Santarem. The winter passed in a fruitless endeavor on the part of the emperor and the marshal to force SOULT d'Erlon and Regnier to cooperate for an advance on Lisbon by the left bank of the Tagus. Meanwhile, in spite of every effort, the French army dwindled owing to disease, desertion, and unending fatigue. So dangerous was the country that a dispatch could not be sent along the lines of communication without an escort of 300 men. The whole countryside had been so swept bare of provisions that a Portuguese spy wrote to Wellington saying, "Heaven forgive me if I wrong them in believing they have eaten my cat." By March 1811, it became clear that the French could no longer maintain themselves at Santarem, but so skillful were Masséna's dispositions that it was 3 days before Wellington realized that at last the enemy had commenced their retreat. Never had the genius of the marshal stood higher than in this difficult retirement from Portugal. With his army decimated by hunger and disease, with the victorious enemy always hanging on his heels, with his subordinates in open revolt, and a Marshal of France refusing to obey orders in the face of the enemy, he lost not a single gun, baggage wagon, or invalid. Still, the morale of his army was greatly shaken. As he himself wrote, "It is sufficient for the enemy to show the heads of a few columns in order to intimidate the officers and make them loudly declare that the whole of Wellington's army is in sight." When the marshal at last placed his wearied troops behind the fortress of Ciudad Rodrigo and Almeida, he found his difficulties by no means at an end. The emperor, who judged men only by results, wrote him a letter full of thinly veiled criticism of his operations, while he found that the country round the fortresses was now included in the command of the northern army under Bessières. Accordingly, he had to apply to that marshal for leave to revictual and equip his troops. Meanwhile, Wellington proceeded to besiege Almeida. By the end of April, after a vigorous correspondence with Bessières, Masséna had at last reorganized his army and was once again ready to take the field against the English. Reinforced by 1,500 cavalry of the Guard under Bessières, at Fuentes d'Onoro, he surprised the English forces covering the siege of Almeida. After a careful reconnaissance at dawn on May 5th, he attacked and defeated the English right. And had it not been for the action of Bessières, who spoiled his combination by refusing to allow the Guard to charge save by his orders, the English would have been totally defeated. Masséna wished at all hazards to continue the fight on the morrow, but his principal officers were strongly opposed to it. Overborne by their counsels, after lying in front of the position for 3 days, he withdrew to Ciudad Rodrigo. It was through no fault of his that he was beaten at Fuentes d'Onoro. Wellington himself confessed how closely he had been pressed when he wrote, "Lord Liverpool was quite right not to move thanks for the Battle of Fuentes, though it was the most difficult I was ever concerned in and against the greatest odds. We had nearly 3 to 1 against us engaged, above 4 to 1 of cavalry, and moreover, our cavalry had not a gallop in them, while some of that of the enemy were quite fresh and in excellent order. If Boney had been there, we should have been beaten." Soon after the battle, Masséna was superseded by Marmont and retired to Paris. The meeting with the emperor was stormy. "Well, Prince of Essling," said Napoleon, "are you no longer Masséna?" Explanations followed, and the emperor at last promised that once again he should have an opportunity of regaining his glory in Spain. But fate willed otherwise. After Salamanca, when Marmont was recalled, Masséna set out again for Spain, only to fall ill at Bayonne and to return home and try to restore his shattered health at Nice. In 1813 and 1814, he commanded the 8th Military District, composed of the Rhône Valley, but he was getting too old to take strenuous measures and was glad to make submission to the Bourbons. Very cruelly, the new government placed an affront on the Marshal by refusing to create him a peer of France under the plea that he was an Italian and a foreigner. But in spite of this, the prince remained faithful during the first part of the 100 Days, and only went over to Napoleon when he found that the capital and army had recognized the emperor. At Paris, the emperor greeted him with, "Well, Masséna, did you wish to serve as lieutenant to the Duke of Angoulême and fight me? Would you have hurled me back into the sea if I had given you time to assemble your forces?" The old warrior replied, "Yes, sire, inasmuch as I believed that you were not recalled by the majority of Frenchmen." Ill health prevented the Marshal from actively serving the emperor. But during the interval between Napoleon's abdication and the Second Restoration, it fell to the Marshal's lot to keep order in Paris as governor and commander of the National Guard. The new government, to punish him for the aid he had given to the emperor, nominated him one of the judges of Marshal Ney. This was the last occasion the Prince of Essling appeared in public. Suspected as a traitor by the authorities, weighed down by the horror of Ney's death and the assassination of his old friend Brune, and racked by disease, after a lingering painful illness, the conqueror of Zurich breathed his last at the age of 59 on April 4, 1817. Even then, the ultra-royalists could not conceal their hatred of him. The war minister, Clark, Duke of Feltre, his old comrade, now turned furious legitimist, had hitherto withheld the Marshal's new baton, and it was only the threat of Masséna's son-in-law, Ryle, to place on the coffin the baton the Marshal had received from the emperor, which at last forced the government to send the emblem. Great soldier as he was, Masséna's escutcheon was stained by many a blot. His avarice was disgusting beyond words, and with avarice went a tendency to underhand dealing, harshness, and malice. During the Wagram campaign, the Marshal's coachman and footmen drove him day by day in a carriage through all the heat of the fighting. The emperor complimented these brave men and said that of all the 130,000 men engaged, they were the bravest. Masséna, after this, felt bound to give them some reward, and said to one of his staff that he was going to give them each 400 francs. The staff officer replied that a pension of 400 francs would save them from want in their old age. The Marshal, in a fury, turned on his aide-de-camp, exclaiming, "Wretch, do you want to ruin me? What, an annuity of 400 francs? No, 400 francs once and for all." Adding to his staff, "I would sooner see you all shot and get a bullet through my arm than bind myself to give an annuity of 400 francs to anyone." The Marshal never forgave the aide-de-camp who had thus urged him to spend his money. His harshness was also well known, and the excesses of the French troops in Switzerland, Naples, and Portugal were greatly owing to his callousness. In the campaign in Portugal, he actually allowed detachments of soldiers to set out with the express intention of capturing all girls between 12 and 20 for the use of his men. But while oblivious to the sufferings of others, as a father, he was affectionate and indulgent. As he said after Wagram of his son Prosper, "That young scamp has given me more trouble than a whole army corps." So careful was he of his safety that he refused during the second day of the battle to allow him to take his turn among the other aides-de-camp. But the young Masséna was too spirited to endure this, and Napoleon, hearing of the occurrence, severely reprimanded the Marshal. Staunch Republican by profession, blustering and outspoken at times, he was at bottom a true Italian, and knew well how to use the delicate art of flattery. Writing in 1805 to the Minister of War, he thus ends a dispatch. "I made my first campaign with His Majesty, and it was under his orders that I learned what I know of the trade of arms. We were together in the army of Italy. Again, when at Fontainebleau he had the misfortune to lose an eye when out pheasant shooting, he attacked Berthier as the culprit, although he knew full well that the emperor was the only person who had fired a shot. But in spite of all this meanness and his many defects, he must always be remembered as one of the great soldiers of France, a name at all times to conjure with. Both Napoleon and Wellington have paid their tribute to his talents. At St. Helena, the fallen emperor said that of all his generals, the Prince of Essling was the first. and the Duke, speaking to Lord Raz of the French commanders, said, "Masséna gave me more trouble than any of them, because when I expected to find him weak, he generally contrived somehow that I should find him strong." The Marshal was a born soldier. War was with him an inspiration. Being all but illiterate, he never studied it theoretically. But, as one of his detractors admits, he was a born general. His courage and tenacity did the rest. In the best days of his military career, he saw accurately, decided promptly, and never let himself be cast down by reverses. It was owing to this obstinacy, combined with clear vision, that his great successes were gained, and the dogged determination he showed at Zurich, Loano, Rivoli, and Genoa was no whit impaired by success or by old age, as he proved at Essling, Wagram, and before the lines of Torres Vedras. Like his great commander, none knew better than the Prince of Essling that fortune must be wooed, and as Napoleon wrote to him, "It is not to you, my dear general, that I need to recommend the employment of audacity." In spite of his ill success in his last campaign, to the end the Prince of Essling worthily upheld his title of the spoilt child of victory.
This concludes Chapter 3 of Napoleon's Marshals by R.P. Dunn-Pattison. Join us also for Chapter 4 about Jean-Baptiste Jules Bernadotte. Subscribe to Major Intonio's channel. We'll get back to you next week. Thank you very much, and so long.